Well, good evening. So I think overall the situation of the Swiss economy is quite good, but there are some issues for concern. In particular, is the situation of productivity. If we look at the amount of growth per employee, well, we see this hasn't really grown over the last 10 years. This is by no means only a Swiss dimension. There's a general productivity slowdown in advanced economy. But in the Swiss case, it's particularly pronounced. And productivity is a key if you want to look at standard of living, also issues about pension funding. Life is always much easier if you can get your productivity going up 1% a year instead of remaining flat. So to me, this is the biggest concern in the medium run for Switzerland. Related to that, the figures we show about the share of profit to GDP, so this share goes up and down with the business cycle. But what is very striking is over the last couple of years, it has remained quite low by historical standard. And this is in part due to the appreciation of the franc. The growth has held quite well. The Swiss real economy has been doing quite well compared to the shock it received with a strong Swiss franc, and I wouldn't have expected it to do so well. But however, this was done a lot by cutting prices. If you want, Switzerland is like a company that can maintain its volume of activity by cutting prices. And like in a company, wages don't go down that easily. So what absorbs this cut is profits. And you clearly see that in the numbers you just showed. Now, why is this a concern looking forward? Well, profits play a big role in funding investment, and especially investments such as research and development, which firms don't really borrow to finance research and development. They tend to finance this more out of retained earnings. Well, if your profit have been very low for several years, this is eating in your funding capacity and has a worrying implication in productivity looking forward.
And what about these pictures in real estate? Earlier, we looked at that market. How strong are the risks that this could see a turn down?
So there has been some slowdown in real estate prices, especially in some areas like the Lake Léman area and Geneva. From my understanding, it's quite concentrated at the top end of the market. But even beyond that, for instance, the building of housing units have been quite brisk over the last couple of years. So there is supply coming on. Will be a slowdown in the market. Now, should we be concerned about that as economists and policymakers? Well, the concern is really about, is there leverage behind the housing? If what you have is your house price go down by 5%, but your equity is 20% of the house, it's not that bad. If it goes down by 5% and you have no equity, then you are underwater. You owe more on your mortgage than the house is worth. And historically, problems have really come from leverage. On that count, I'm reasonably optimistic. For the last couple of years, we've had very active measures by the Swiss National Bank and the banking regulator to make sure that bank would be careful of lending to people who can afford the house. Because it's important to remember, if the interest rate is low, let's say 1%, and if it goes down to 2%, that may not seem much, but you're doubling your payment on your mortgage. And that if people are already quite on the fence of making the payments, that can tip them over. So it's important to have criteria that the loan is adequate compared to the person's income and the value of the house. And the Swiss authorities have been very proactive on that one. And I think we will see a benefit from that.
And if we look again at these job market figures, which we saw earlier, they also look good. But then there's that puzzling piece about the social assistance expenditures are also rising. Why is that? Is the job market just difficult to access in Switzerland?
So there is a challenge in Switzerland is how we handle people who can be on the margins. This can be people with limited education, but it's also important to remember that a couple of years ago we voted to make the unemployment benefit a bit stricter. So what happens when you exhaust your benefit? Well, many people just drop on the statistics, but others end up with what we call social help, which is kind of the safety net of last resort. It's a very stringent safety net. It basically allows you to eat and have a roof over your head, and that's about it. And so a lot of people who do not get unemployment benefit end up there. A group, for instance, that is particularly at risk is older unemployed. People 50 years and over, if you lose your job and you're 50 and over, it's very hard to get one, or you will get what at a lower salaries. So the unemployment rate may not be that much higher for this group. However, it's a very different unemployment. It's once you're out. And that these people tend to end up in social help, and that's what boosts the number.
And that's a bit what explains that differentiation. Now, if we look at exports, a key driver, as we saw as well earlier, is the share of pharma and chemicals here in Switzerland. What does this tell us about the Swiss economy? Are we diversified enough?
So the good thing about the pharma sector, it's a sector that is very insensitive to exchange rate. So if you have the Swiss franc going up and down, it's a sector that's not going to suffer much. Pharma are not good that are price sensitive. So you get some resilience that way. This said, we now have about half of export that are pharma and chemical, and this has a bit of a concern of whether we're getting diversified enough. It's always risky if you have too much of your export in one particular category. It's better to be more diversified. Also, an open question is how job intensive are these exports? Pharma can have quite high prices, so a given value of your export actually comes a lot from the price, and there may be fewer jobs behind that extra franc of export that you would get in machinery.
And if we finish up a minute about the external demand is strong, as we said before, for Swiss exports. But I mean, how long can that last? Is that sustainable?
Well, Switzerland, being a small open economy, has always been tied to the global business cycle. There's nothing new there, and it will follow what the world does. A source that concerns me a bit is the relative weakness of domestic demand. We often see having a net export, a surplus, as a sign of strength. Well, economic analysis tells you that's absolutely not the case. It can be a good thing, it can be a bad thing. You really have to understand what's behind it. And what is striking in Switzerland is consumption is kind of low. If you compare the household consumption to the value of wages, it used to be roughly the same amount. Now we have gone down quite a bit. So it looks like Swiss households are saving quite a lot. And if these savings cannot only be placed in Switzerland, they would be placed abroad, which look like a trade surplus by accounting. So the Swiss trade surplus can be more of a sign of limited domestic demand. And domestic demand is, at the end of the day, what produces well-being. If I work, it's not because I want to just accumulate an income per se, it's I want to consume it and enjoy it.
Thank you so much, Professor, very much for being with us
pleasure.
here tonight on The Big Picture.